Before we begin this programme, we have to introduce ourselves. I'm John Fee, born and raised in the Grassmarket, a former history teacher and now a Royal Mile Festival guide.
I'm George Brown, raised in Fountain Bridge, one of its local historians and co-author of The Three Great Roads, which covers the history of the Westport, Tollcross and Fountain Bridge. As a local artist, you'll see my own impressions of those neighbourhoods.
The programme itself was developed from a slide talk into a documentary, which has less to do with kings, queens and politicians, and more to do with people themselves, those who were once part of those communities and those who still are.
We hope you'll find this programme both interesting and entertaining.
Belong to the Westport, the land of Bergen Hill, where Robinson Crusoe used to flit. Evil old shots with no digit, a 45 medals for swinging away. Llewellyn's got 93. If when I get a bite and a tighter of muscles, the Westport belongs to me.
I belong to the Westport, the land of Birkenhead. Popular ballad at one time, sung here by a local worthy and poet, Harry Young. Harry knew the Westport all right, because in his younger days when he was in employment, he worked for the gas board and he was a lamplighter, and he would be the man who would come to the common stair and change the gas mantles and the street lamps for lighting in the area. The children knew him even better because after Harry retired, he took a job as lollipop man in Tollcross Primary School.
This is the Heritage Trail map that takes in the subject of our tour. Note the word outline of general history of the Westport, Tollcross and Fountain Bridge. It's just an outline. Note the castle at the top of the map. Below it, to the right, the Grassmarket, where we begin our tour. The streets we will walk are coloured yellow, and all the area in the map was once just part of a huge forest that stretched from the castle to the Pentlands. The forest of Drumshook in ancient times. But by the Middle Ages, all here was not forest, not around the castle. Edinburgh and its suburbs. It's the 15th century here, a map. There have been some changes since the ancient times. A castle, the Great Stone Castle, that had grown from a small fort. Down from it, a growing town. It stretches to Holyrood Abbey. It was once called Dunedin, which is the Gaelic for Fort on the Hill. Then its present name, Edinburgh. The forest has been cleared in some places. Note the red area to the left of the castle. At that time, the Royal Orchards. And up to the 19th century, the Bread Street of today was still called Orchardfield Street. And below the castle, to the left, marked green, the future Grassmarket. Note the high ground above the Grassmarket, to the left, marked yellow. And that was a place for growing crops, so it was called the Higher Eggs, which is now Lorison Place. And it stretched right down to where Tollcross is today. Now everything in yellow here did not belong to Edinburgh. All that countryside belonged to the noble family of tourists. Note the Borraloch to the left, the future meadows. But especially, note this narrow road climbing up from the Grassmarket. It became our Westport. And it's very important here because see how it joins three roads. It's a main point, for these roads are trade roads, going north, south and west, taking goods to and from the city. Trade meant wealth, so our narrow climbing road became prosperous, and it grew into a town of its own, just outside the city gate. And the next map, a bird's eye view, drawn in 1580s by Braun and Hogenberg, a city enclosed by a huge defensive wall and a loch to the north. This was after the Scots were defeated by the English at Flodden, down south, in 1513, and they feared a follow-up by the English, so up went that wall, called the Flodden Wall. It was built to keep them out. In some places, it was 30 feet high and 5 feet thick. The map shows 5 fortified gates. Now the Scots called gates ports, And so you can see the wall coming down from the castle and stopping at its west gate or port. You can see that outside it a small town has grown. Now, since a town was called a borough, that small town outside its west port was called Westerport's Borough, and the gate opens into the city's Grass Market. So here we are at the west end of the Grass Market, and towering above it, Edinburgh's famous castle, once the centre of Scottish power when kings and queens ruled from it. And down from its south bank stretched the great Flodden Wall, passing the road that once led to the king's stables, and then crossing the Grass Market, roughly in line with those houses there. They were not there, of course, at the time. And then stopping at the huge fortified gate or port that shut out the growing town of Westerport's Borough, the future Westport. Well, the Westport here, that gate or port has long gone, but that's where it stood, right at the entrance to the Westport. It was a royal entrance, and through that fortified gate rode Scottish kings and queens when visiting our capital city. Great military processions on horseback behind them, fanfares, bells ringing and crowds cheering. Now, this corner of the Grass Market, where the Vendel is, was also a very religious part of our old town, especially for the Covenanters, the Scots Presbyterians, who rebelled against the king. Here they are, the Scottish Covenanters, in the nearby Greyfriars churchyard. The year is 1638, and they're signing a document, a covenant, and it's a national covenant, telling King Charles I that he must stop interfering with their parliament and, above all, their Presbyterian religion. The king wanted all his British subjects to follow his religion, Episcopalian, and the Covenanters were prepared to go to war over this. And they did, and many were hanged here in the Grass Market. But in the end they won, and they built their own covenanting churches where the Vendel is today. Some parts of their churches can still be seen up there. This was once just a steep hill, and the Flodden Wall climbed up from the west gate to the top, and then it turned east to enclose the rest of the city. And there is still a section of it at the very top of the steps. Now, into the Westport. To the left, grass and trees. And it used to be a child's play garden in the 1930s. It was first set up as a garden area by Patrick Geddes, now Scotland's 19th and 20th century pioneer of town planning. And most green patches, grass and trees that you see in our old town today were planned by Sir Patrick Geddes. He was ahead of his time. Now, rising up behind that garden is a part of Edinburgh's Royal College of Art. Now we take a look across at the other side of the street. Well, across here is Lady Wynd. And right there, beside it, is an upmarket Westport pub. Oddly enough, it's called the Grass Market Bar. Now, in the 30s, it was called the Globe. Great sing-songs there. They often ended up in street fights. Square goes, they call them. No fighting was allowed in pubs. And beside it there is the narrow lane that links up with King's Stables Road. In the 14th century, a small chapel stood there, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, so Lady Wynd. Down there also, by the 17th century, was a slaughterhouse. Here it is, the Shambles, it was called. It was a messy place, but it did a roaring trade with the Grass Market cattle market, just next door. But the smell and the fear of animal diseases caused it to be closed in 1850. Then the meat trade moved to Fountain Bridge. Now up a bit to Westport, to Portsborough Square. Balconied housing built about 1900. Dozens of big families crammed in here, right up until well after the Second World War, when the housing boom began, and it nearly emptied the Westport. Westport was all renovated and reconstructed in the 1980s, and now the name itself, Portsborough, as I said, meant Gate Town, which the Westport was. and an old drawing here proves the point. The Portsborough coat of arms. Here was its coat of arms up here on the wall of its old council hall, or courthouse, on the north side, halfway up. It had its own bailies and magistrates, its council officials, just like the city itself. And even when it was sold to Edinburgh in 1648 by its landowner, it was still semi-independent. It had its own jailhouse and parish church, St Cuthbert's, the West End, and controlled its suburbs, which stretched into the countryside, which of course became Tollcross and Fountain Bridge. So it was a power centre. Now, if it was a gate borough, it was also a crafts borough with 6 specialised trades guilds with their own legal charters and emblems, and they were all doing great business here. One craft was the weavers, called the Websters. Here is Webster's land now. New building here by Barrett in the 1980s, and it's there that the weavers' coat of arms in modest form is up on the wall. This was the site of their houses and workshops, and just up a bit on the south side of the street opposite was Cordoners' land. Cordoners were leather workers, and that's where they worked. That was their coat of arms. A great export trade in leather by the 18th century. But the Westport borough fell on hard times, as did the city itself, as this map shows. Here is Edgard's map, 1742. And by mid-18th century, the old town Edinburgh was congested. And on each side of the houses, the closest, packed together. Old houses crumbling, sanitation was primitive. Too many people living in filth and disease. So a new town was built to the north, but only for the wealthy. The Westport off the Grass Market became just as bad. Old Westport houses here. And old Westport is in a bad way. As with the old town itself, its wealthier people had left it to live in the poor streets of the new town, Princess Street, George Street, Queen Street, and other residential areas. The Westport had no semi-independence after 1850, when it became just another of Edinburgh's political wards. A place now for gin shops, drinking dens, and lodging houses and worse places. Just the right hunting ground for 2 infamous characters who lived in Tanner's Close, just further up the street there. William Burke and William Hare. Now, too long a story to tell here, but it can be summed up. 2 Irish labourers from Ulster gave up their work as navvies in the Union Canal when Hare married the widow owner of a Westport lodging house in Tanner's Close and brought in his friend, Burke, and his girlfriend. And they set up business there in Tanner's Close. Edinburgh's medical faculty were at that time desperate for dead bodies for research, and the 2 Williams were perfectly happy to help them out. No, not digging dead bodies up. They got them live, and then they got them drunk, and then dead. About £7 a body. They were eventually caught after 13 murders. Only 1 body was ever recovered. And when Hare turned King's evidence against his partner, Burke took the rap, and he swung for it in the Lawn Market before a record crowd of 30,000 people. Yet the social conditions of the time produced more corpses than our 2 mass murderers ever did. Cholera, TB, smallpox were knocking off thousands of poor and nourished people. There was plenty of these in the Westport by this time. Crombie's land. Housing actually was built by a landlord, Crombie, about in the middle of the Westport. Made entirely of wood, actually. Now rotten wood. No sinks, no clean water, crowded with poor people. It was demolished with some others when an Act of Parliament was passed to do this, 1867. One man and his supporters did their best. He was the moderator of the first Free Church of Scotland. He was Dr. Thomas Chalmers. What he did was he divided up some of the really poor areas of the old town into what he called territories, and there he built churches, and he called them 3 territorial churches. This is a territorial church in the Westport. It's no longer a church here in the 1980s, but here it was that they did more than singing hymns and praying. They went on there and did all kinds of good social work. It was from here that Chalmers and his assistants administered charity schemes, including education, advice, and practical help too, for the Westport's demoralised poor. That building there beside it was once a local police station with housing for the local police, and when they were centralised in High Street, part of it continued with social work in the Westport. From the 1930s on, it was called the Tweedy Memorial Boys Club, and it was run by an Edinburgh solicitor, Richard Miller, bonzo to the boys. Took kids off the street, indoor games, boxing, football. Then there was summer camps, old folks' nights, all on the ground floor there, and the basement too. To the right of that there was the local fire station. The Westport's fire station now is called Braidwood Pub, named after a famous fireman. Top of the Westport there, and Lady Lawson Street, of course. There's the main point ahead, and this is where Lady Lawson Street intersects with the Westport. It was once a narrow lane, named after a Lady Lawson. She was the wife of Lord Lawson, an 18th century royal official. In the 19th century, it was widened and extended down to Spittal Street. Top of the Westport there brings back many memories to a great many people. Up here was Harkis, sold everything that could grace a family table. Crone's, fishmonger, Dixon's, cakes, pies, Ramsay's cooked meat, Thompson's a meal dealer, Fotheringham the newsagent, and if you ran out of money, there was the pawn shop too. Such a range of goods and services in such a short street in the 1930s and 40s. There's the old fire station and the new art college. The old fire station, built in 1900, is now used as a fire service museum. Now we're on high ground here, Lauriston Place, named after the Law family of Lauriston Castle, Davidson's Mines. Nobility had their town mansions up here, the Borthwicks, Earl of Weems, others. What you see now, one time was just a field called Cuddy's Park for the sale of cattle. Up to the end of the 19th century, it was all about animals in this area. Look at this. Cattle in Lauriston Place. It looks like a Midwestern cow town, but it's Lauriston Place on market day. Even so, Lauriston Place in the 19th century became a posh enough place to live in. Well into our century, the place for doctors and dentists and teachers and other professionals who spoke the same language, never slang. It's 2-story houses, attics, basements, back gardens. It didn't stop the Germans, however. Lauriston bomb damage here. During the famous Zeppelin raid of 1916, the grass market was bombed, but Lauriston Place also got its share of the bomb blast. Next to that house there, which is number 39 incidentally, was a very important place for worried people of the early 20th century. The Ringworm School, number 41 Lauriston Place. But there were other things that ordinary Edinburgh folk feared far more than the Germans. Things caused by living in overcrowded conditions and by poor diet, TB, skin infections like scabies and impetigo, and the dreaded ringworm disease. Children, mostly from the slums, were treated here at the Ringworm School. And across from there was certainly respectable enough for the Edinburgh's Jewish community to worship. Synagogue, Graham Street, 1914. This was once a Greyfriars Church, and it became a synagogue in 1898. And the Jewish worshippers came here until 1932, when they moved to a new one in Salisbury Road. But the Irish were in Edinburgh before the Jews, and they built one of their first churches just down the road in Lauriston Street, 1868. Now we're in the Jesuit Church of the Sacred Heart. Like all churches, it served as a community centre in those days, Men and women's guilds, societies, scouts, guides, cubs, brownies, and one of the biggest boys' clubs in the city. Lorison Boys Club. Here they are. Catholic or Protestant, if you could play football or box, you were well in here. A great record of sporting achievements. Many boxing and football trophies. But also a place where Protestants and Catholics and Jews and atheists paid their weekly visits. Just across the road from the Sacred Heart Church. The Beverley Cinema. Called the Beverley here by 1954. But it was once the popular Blue Halls, which opened in the early 1930s. It had been a variety theatre. Who doesn't remember the Saturday matinees at the Blue Doos? Hundreds of kids queuing up there. Uniform commissioner, medals and moustache. And when leaving it, the kids transformed themselves into cowboys and Indians. Galloping home, or Tarzans, howling as they ran. Its last film was Tarzan. Tarzan Triumph. Johnny Weissmuller in 1954. As the Beverley, its last film was in 1959. It was Carousel. Across from there, the street that leads to Tollcross now, that had to do with the food of life. St Cuthbert's Bakers, an old Westport borough tradition. The trade of the Baxters, they called it, meaning bakers. Proud men, top paid. And St Cuthbert's Bakery turned into the High Riggs, as it still does. Here's the High Riggs in 1904. It used to be called Cow Feeder Row. It used to be a smithy along there, or a farrier, on the north side of the street. Throughout the 30s and 40s, kids watched the horses being shoed and sparks flying in the dark smithy. Now, we're in the High Riggs here, but we're looking back. And on this painting here, 1850, those houses were later demolished. But now, we go down the High Riggs, and then we turn left into a lane that leads to the bottom of Lorison Place, to a short street, just off Lorison Place, Glen Street. Quiet, not a child in sight. Once there were two primary schools at the very bottom, right opposite each other. St Ignatius Catholic School and All Saints, a Protestant school. And the kids themselves running up and down, across and back. You couldn't tell a Protestant from a Catholic. Here's one class. St Ignatius, about 7 or 8 years old. About 1926 too, or 27. These are kids from all around the surrounding working class districts. Kids with Scotch, Irish and Italian names. No school uniform here. They couldn't afford one anyway, but they were well behaved, just like this lot. They had to be. All Saints Group, 1923, basically the same type of youngsters, doing what they're told, except maybe him. He's obviously refused to wash his face for the school footy. That will be his sister there, not much cleaner. But once there was another place that welcomed them all, just for the price of a ticket, right here, just across from Glen Street, used to be the Tollcross Cinema. The building's gone now. Its nickname actually was the Toll X, opening in 1912 as a theatre, and then it became a cinema, but it was taken over by the Lucas family, but in the 1940s. A great cinema too for slinking in, the back door in the lane. It was easy, but then I wouldn't know. So many great films seen here, but no time to recall them. Now a Tollcross personality here, without doubt a Tollcross man, the Lorison acupuncturist and hearing expert, but in younger days, as you've heard, a good singer too. Ranald claims his descent from the Highland chiefs of Keppoch and has proved it too. Also, he used to fight for the Tollcross cause through his Tollcross newspaper. The Westport's main point, where you saw the three great trade roads used to meet back in time. A place for traders to pay their toll, or their road tax, you might say. That building was in fact the old customs house, dates from 1770. After that it became a pawn shop. Now we pass around it to continue west into Fountain Bridge, but first, just a look down Bridge Street. The old key shop. It's a well-remembered shop. This is it here in 1910 and it's still there today. This was its first proprietor, Duncan McLaren. His name's still there. A Lauriston man, and he brought up his family right here. A respected name round here. His son became Dr. John and his grandson became Dr. Alistair McLaren. No health service in those days, and few were insured. Yet both doctors seldom failed to answer calls from poorer people in the district where there was no promise of the payment. 2 and 6 a visit. They were the Dr. Cameron and Dr. Finlay of the inter and post-war period. East Fountain Bridge, old St Cuthbert's store to the right, now the posh Point Hotel, and a new building here, the Unemployment and Jobs Centre. But it's a building that used to stand here that concerns us. It was a place opened in 1886 by John Henry Cook, the leader of a famous circus family, which became a new theatre. This was his venue in Lothian Road, Cook's Circus. Wild animals, dogs, pigeons, a daring young man on the flying trapeze, that was his son. Well, he took them all up to the Palladium in East Fountain Bridge. The great showman realised the importance of a new form of entertainment, just beginning, the silent pictures. And he began to show them here, with his famous silver screen suspended from the ceiling over the circus ring. The Palladium became a theatre in 1932. Many promising variety artists performed here. A popular theatre, it kept up with the times, like this for example. Here's the Palladium Cafe, one of the first city theatres to boast an all-American style cafe and espresso coffee bar in the 50s. And that figure there, serving, is George Brown, my colleague's mother. From 1886 to 1985, when it was demolished, after nearly 100 years, just beside the Palladium was this shop, the sweet shop, sweets and cigarettes. Not many kids would let their parents pass this well-remembered shop. Once you could continue past this shop and the Palladium, and passing the busy SMT garage, until you came to shops at the end. The Valder Cafe, the headquarters of the Valder gang. Then a newsagent, the pawn shop upstairs, and at the corner, a Rankin's fruit shop with a Tudor-style tea room above it, well remembered. Then it all went, and for a while nothing. Then all the new buildings went up. But on the opposite side, there was still some of the original buildings past the Point Hotel. In fact, that section is still there. This old shop here, for example, Tom's Drapery, a very popular drapery by a cheery proprietor, Mr. Tom. Then his son, and he had branches in Gorgie and Southside and Leith, and in the great chippy next door, the Kingsway Restaurant. Now before we go on, straight on, I'll look round the corner into Lothian Road, which remember, it was once a suburb of the old Wester Portsmouth. Here we have a street artist, back in the early 20s. Posh Edwardians passing him by. Just right place for a poor pavement artist. Posh houses too, like Cambridge Street across there. And yet poor kids in our district here went to school there. Right over there, about 1818 until 1912, until the Fountain Bridge School was ready for them. And then it was replaced, that building, by the Usher Hall in 1913. Across from there today stands the Sheraton Hotel. But once it was a workhouse. It stood there, and we still have the stone carved plaque that was above its great solid doors. It reads, "My son, defraud not the poor of his living, and make not the needy eyes wait long." Actually, St Cuthbert's workhouse was one of the city's 3 workhouses by the 19th century. It had a section for lunatics too. St Cuthbert's, of course, was the parish church of the old Wester Portsmouth, and a church still sits on its site. Rising up from the graveyard below, that's its 18th century spire. And the church originally was dedicated to the Celtic missionary St Cuthbert, a 7th century saint. a church mentioned in the 12th century. But in fact, it goes back to the 9th century. So, Lothian Road and its historic connections. According to legend, Lothian Road was roughly built in a single day, 1778, because of a wager made by Sir John Clark of Pennycook, which he won. Another historical point here. We've already dealt with Burke and Hare, who murdered their victims, but then there were the resurrectionists. They were the originals. They dug up the dead, and St Cuthbert's churchyard here was very much involved with this activity. Some of its official grave diggers were often bribed, else the body snatchers or resurrectionists just plucked the body up from the grave. There was many riots down here because of this, and it wasn't until they built the watchtower there, just at the corner, that we saw a real improvement. St Cuthbert's Boys Brigade Reunion. Happy Tollcross, Fountain Bridge men, all members of St Cuthbert's Boys Brigade, and celebrating that fact. Oh, we could name them all, but we must go on now, back on the trail. This short street takes up the route from Lothian Road. It was once called Wellington Street, and it became Earl Grey Street after 1832. Building society, now where Grant's large furniture store used to stand, and the popular XL bar known to so many. Now, 2 minutes and we're in central Tollcross. Fleming's store, Earl Grey Street. And we're looking back along Earl Grey Street. And once again, we're looking back in time. The popular Fleming's store was there, the central hall above it, and to the left here is West Tollcross, which led to the old tram depot, but now it leads to the new fire station. Everything in that hardware store from a needle to an anchor. Now, this is central Tollcross, looking east. We're standing in Home Street, the centre. To the left there is Thornybock, wash house there once, but we're looking east again, east of the higher rigs there, and the foot of Lorison Place. It didn't always look like that. It was always, for long enough, pastoral countryside in the old days. 1780s. Just on the city's doorstep, a thriving agricultural economy during a period of great agricultural improvement. Followed later, of course, by the industrial change that took place in this area, as well as everywhere else. Now, Tollcross Centre here, the early 20th century, and this is less than 150 years later. More change, trams now, but we still need horses. Soon will come the cable tram, and then the electric tram, then our excellent bus service. All in the name of progress. Talking of progress, Rygo Street in the hungry 30s. Remember the barber shop? 2 church halls there, belonging to St Cuthbert's Free and the Greyfriars Free churches, dancing to a 3-piece band there on Friday and Saturday nights. A regular dancer there was the teenage James Bond, Sean Connery. The street was formerly called Dunbar Street, but after the Peninsular War, it was renamed Rygo Street after a distinguished Portuguese soldier. And talking of soldiers, 1939, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die. And that's what these lads will be doing soon, for king and country. The usual brew queue here in Rygo Street has changed to recruitment queue. It's 1939, Britain's at war with Germany, and they'll soon be far from old Tollcross. Tollcross West. The Barclay Bruntsfield Church there, with its massive steeple and chancels on each side, built in 1860s by Frank Pilkington. And nearer to us, to the left, is just at the corner of Tarvett Street, the King's Theatre, opened in 1906 with pantomime, Cinderella. It was to bring many of the big names of stage and screen to Tollcross. Sarah Bernhardt to Ingrid Bergman, John Gielgud to Laurence Olivier, comedy stars from Harry Lauder to Stanley Baxter, International Ballet and Opera was all here. But what was here before? This is the site of the King's Theatre, Marshall's Fruit and Vegetable Market, once stocked from its own market garden there. The chimney at the back belongs to Taylor MacLeod Brewery, which caused the gentry living in this area to migrate about 1760s, because, as they said, the brewery lowered the tone of the area. Interestingly, when the King's was being renovated about 25 years ago, workmen discovered the original brewery well below the stage. And talking of gentry, to the left there, Darvett Street, which leads to Drumdrain Street, the site of Drumdrain House. There it is. It's long gone now, but once it was the town mansion of the Homerig family, who had property at Tarvett in Fife. Now this painting here looks east again. Tollcross, 1950s. Now more could be said and shown about Tollcross, but Fountain Bridge beckons us to bring it back into our story.